Welcome to our webinar, What's New in Fungicide Resistance? My name is Nola D'Souza and I'm the Project Coordinator for AFREN, the Australian Fungicide Resistance Extension Network. Now, our network, just get the slides up here, sorry. Our network is a GRDC funded project that brings together fungicide resistance experts, plant pathologists and extension services from around the country. And our aim is to develop and deliver regionally specific resources to help mitigate the impact of fungicide resistance in Australia. Today, we have three of our experts here to tell you about some of the new developments in fungicide resistance, as well as our AFREN project leader, Associate Professor Fran Lopez from the Centre for Crop and Disease Management at Curtin Uni. He'll be here to answer any questions that you may have at the end of our presentation. As much as we love to discuss this topic, we do have over 100 registrants for this webinar, so we'd like to direct you to have a look at the bottom of your screen and ask all of your questions using the Q&A button there at the bottom. It's next to the chat, but use the Q&A. Then we'll answer those questions as we go along, or I will answer the question to the panel at the end of the presentations. Also, we'd really appreciate your feedback after the webinar by answering a few survey questions to compare your understanding before and after the presentation. Please don't mark us down for being late. We very apologise for that. So let's get started. Before I introduce the panel, let's first take a step back and validate your knowledge of what fungicide resistance is and how it happens. Definition of fungicide resistance is when a previously effective fungicide fails to control disease in the field at the maximum recommended rate. Now, there are some caveats that go with this definition because there are a number of reasons why fungicide application might fail that aren't related to fungicide resistance. So, for example, this might be poor timing of application, poor coverage due to a closed canopy crop, using ineffective rates, or spraying in unsuitable weather. So the first caveat is that you need to know that the fungicide was applied correctly, and keeping good records and monitoring your crop afterwards can give you the confidence to notice that reduction in disease control that could be fungicide resistance. If you suspect that it is, then this needs to be confirmed in the laboratory. Plant pathologists will do both genetic testing to identify fungicide resistance genes and perform biological tests exposing the pathogen to different dosages of fungicide to determine its effectiveness. The final requirement is that the lab detection needs to be linked to a loss of disease control in the field before we can claim it as fungicide resistance. So how does fungicide resistance develop? Sorry, just waiting on my screen here. Try that again. There we go. Fungicide resistance is a result of selection pressure on naturally occurring individuals within a population. So here we have a pathogen population on a cereal plant causing disease, and this individual here, there we go, this individual here has naturally mutated and is resistant to a particular mode of action fungicide. Now, when you spray the fungicide, most of the sensitive individuals in a population are controlled, but the resistant individuals are not. Continual spraying of the same mode of action fungicide exerts a selection pressure on the resistant individual, allowing it to continue to multiply. And it then becomes the dominant population in the paddock, which can no longer be controlled by that fungicide. Using the same mode of action fungicide drives selection pressure and is the major contributing factor to fungicide resistance, but there are other contributing factors. Lack of genetic resistance in the crop varieties, poor integrated disease management, and a pathogen-conducive season all contribute to increasing the inoculum load and potentially the emergence of naturally occurring mutations that lead to fungicide resistance. So with that knowledge in mind, I will now introduce you to our first speaker. Associate Professor Angela Van de Wouw from the University of Melbourne has 20 years of experience in plant pathology and molecular biology. She's currently based in Horsham, Victoria, and she's focusing on fungicide resistance in blackleg of canola. Today, she will tell you about what is new in that field on the Eyre Peninsula. Thanks, Angela.
So we've been looking at fungicide resistance for the last 5 or so years for the blackleg populations across Australia. And the way we do this is by collecting stubble from fields. We bring it back to Horsham and we let it mature over the summer and autumn months. And then once it is ready to fire its spores, we use the stubble to inoculate the plants underneath that have been treated with different commercial fungicides. We then let those seedlings grow for for 10 to 14 days, and we look at the amount of disease that we see afterwards. So this is just some pictures here highlighting that. So you can see this is a tub with a bag of stubble over the top of it. So each stubble is in its own container. And then here are some pictures of some infected seedlings. So we have our untreated control here on the left, which you can see lots of lesions developing, and even some plants are starting to die. And then we have a resistant population to the DMI fungicides, where you can see again lots of lesions and plants dying. And then here you can see this population is still completely effective against Saltro, the SDHI fungicides. So we find that this assay is extremely high throughput and extremely sensitive. So because we're using the stubble to do the inoculations, we're actually screening hundreds of thousands to millions of spores with each screen. So if there is fungicide resistance there, we are likely to detect it. We count the number of lesions that we get on our untreated plants, and we compare that to the number of lesions that we're getting on our treatments, and then this gives us a resistance scores. In addition to this, as Nola sort of alluded to, we want to make sure that we can confirm this in the laboratory. So we collect isolates and then we do some experiments in the lab to make sure what we're seeing is real and that we are getting resistant isolates. So as I said, we've been doing this for quite a few years now. So this is the results from each of our assays since 2018. So each sort of column is 1 year. In brackets is the number of samples that we've screened each year. And then along the y-axis there, you've got each of the different fungicides that we've looked at over time. And I guess the first thing to note is that when the entire time that we've been screening, we have detected resistance to the DMI fungicides. So keeping in mind that the DMIs were first released in 1997 and have been regularly used as a seed treatment and a fertilizer amended fungicide. So they have been used for a very long time. So it's not that surprising that we're seeing resistance to these DMIs. One of the things about what we're seeing for the DMIs is that it's an increased tolerance rather than a full resistance. So down the bottom here, you've got some untreated plants, some group 3 and some group 7 treated plants. And they've been inoculated with one of these resistant isolates. And what you can see is, whilst we get disease on the group 3 fungicides, the amount of disease isn't the same as our untreated. So it's giving it an increased tolerance to these fungicides, but it's not a complete loss of the fungicide. What we have noticed, though, in the last couple of years is that the frequency of these isolates have definitely increased quite dramatically. But at the moment, we don't have any reports of field failure from around the country. And we think, again, this is because this type of resistance is an increased tolerance. So the fungicides still do have some effect. It's just not as effective as it normally would be. So we really need to do a bit more work around linking that level of resistance with field efficacy. And the other thing we're really interested in, again, I guess coming back to what Nola said, and also there was a couple of questions that were posted prior to the talk around what fungicide regimes are we using that's driving resistance. And so one of the things we've been doing with this survey is collecting data on what fungicides went on the crop each year for that population. And we've pulled that data out, and we've got here on the bottom is the number of DMI applications that went on a crop. And we've correlated that to our frequency of resistance in each of these populations. And what you can see here is that we're really not seeing any strong correlation between the number of fungicide applications and resistance for the DMIs. Now, there's a couple of reasons for this. One could be that because the resistance was already found and it's had evolved prior to 2015, that we've already done the damage, and so it doesn't, like, we're not seeing then any big drivers that are increasing the resistance. Or alternatively, we really need a better understanding of what's happened in a whole farming system and for multiple years of history rather than just looking at the 1 year before. So we're going to be doing a fair bit of work in this space in our new project that we've got up, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Now, I guess the big thing for last year's surveys was that we detected resistance to the SDHI chemistries for the first time. So you can see down here these little red lines on Olivo and Saltro. We hadn't detected anything like that previously. These isolates all came from populations that we had collected from the Eyre Peninsula. So you can see here, this is a couple of examples. We've got, again, on population on the left where you can see the Saltro is completely effective. However, the population on the right, which is one of these ones with the red dots, you can see that the plants have been completely colonized by the pathogen, suggesting that there was resistance. We found 2 paddocks which had high levels of resistance, 3 with moderate, 9 with low, and 27 with none out of our populations that we screened. As I mentioned, we then always collect isolates to confirm this. And so this is just an example here of a couple of the isolates that we collected. So in pink is our susceptible control. So all 3 isolates have been inoculated onto untreated plants or plants treated with each of the different actives of the SDHIs. And you can see that the susceptible isolate is susceptible indeed against all of those chemistries. However, our isolate in blue here, it seems to be fully resistant to all 4 actives. And then we have our isolate in green here where we're seeing an intermediate resistance to a couple of the actives. We're still effective against flupiram, and then we're completely lost of efficacy against the fluxin peroxide. So we're getting some isolates that are fully resistant and other isolates that have either intermediate or varied resistance to the different actives. Just to visualize this, this is in the middle here is our SDHI resistant isolate, the one that was in blue. And what you can see here is that group 7 treatment. You can see that the lesions are completely colonized just to the same level as the untreated. So we really do have that full resistance compared to the DMIs where we get that increased tolerance. So we wanted to look at this in a bit more detail because we were surprised to find this. So what we did is we took 5 different stubbles from last year's screen, and we then used that stubble in a similar way, and we inoculated plants that had been treated with Jockey, Saltro, Olivo. And then we grew those plants up to maturity to see what the impact would be on disease severity. So essentially what we saw was that our 2 populations that had low or no resistance to either of the chemistries, you can see here, the higher the bar graph, the more efficient the fungicide was. And you can see that all 3 chemistries were still highly effective against those 2 populations. When we screened it with a population that was had high resistance to the DMIs, but no resistance to the SDHIs, you can see that the Jockey has lost efficacy, but our 2 SDHIs were still working. However, when we looked at our moderate and our high SDHI resistant populations, you can see that for this one, the Olivo still was working. However, the Saltro was completely ineffective. And this last population, you can see that both Saltro and Olivo were completely, were much less effective as well. So I guess the messages then for industry around this is that the SDHI chemistries are likely to be compromised on the Eyre Peninsula. We do have a caveat on this. We did limit our sampling. Our sampling was limited mostly to the Eyre Peninsula last year. We didn't do many other regions, so we don't know if this resistance would be detected in other places. And we're going to be doing more around this in the new project. In regions where the resistance has been detected, we would suggest try and avoid the SDHI chemistries where possible. We appreciate that that's not necessarily that easy to do. But if you are using an SDHI, perhaps use it in a formulation with a DMI to increase your chances of it working. We suggest that you monitor your crops to ensure that the fungicides are working efficiently, and potentially leave an unsprayed strip for comparison and get out there and have a look at lesions sort of 2 weeks to 3 weeks after you've put on the fungicide and there's been rainfall events. And try and rely on some of these other management strategies wherever possible to minimise disease pressure. So using a cultivar with high blackleg rating, isolating from last year's stubble, and there's a range of other things in the blackleg management guide. And I guess just to sort of further on from this, it is really important to select adequate genetic resistance for your region. So this can reduce your reliance on fungicides for the control of blackleg. If you have used a group 7 treatment as a seedling fungicide, you cannot come back, or you should not come back with a SDHI fungicide at the 4 to 6 leaf stage. You should not be doing that back-to-back selection pressure. And you really should not be putting on more than 2 applications of an SDHI fungicide in a growing season. If you do require fungicides, try and minimise the number of applications. And the way to do this is to think about what aspect of disease you really need to control. So if you're sowing early, try and avoid putting on a 4 to 8 leaf foliar spray, because if you're sowing early, you're going to escape a lot of the disease that leads to crown canker. So you probably don't need that 4 to 8 leaf spray because crown canker is not going to be a big issue. So save your fungicides for your 30% bloom. However, if you're sowing late, then you probably do require that 4 to 8 leaf foliar fungicide, but you won't then need your 30% bloom spray for upper canopy infections. So just be mindful of what aspect of the disease you're controlling and whether you can then minimise the number of applications. And the other thing to keep in mind is if you are putting out a spray for sclerotinia, even if you're not aiming to control blackleg, those fungicides still do have an impact on blackleg and will contribute to the selection of fungicide resistance. So just something to keep in mind as you're doing those sort of things. Lastly, we do have a new project up with GRDC, an NGN investment, and so we're going to be really increasing our surveillance for fungicide resistance. So we're aiming to do 50 paddocks from WA, South Australia, Victoria and New South Wales this year, so that we get a better idea of how widespread this resistance is. And also really focusing on working out whether we are getting field failure for those chemistries. So we're doing a range of experiments in the glasshouse, but also in the field on the Eyre Peninsula and around Victoria. And we are going to go back now, and we've got a range of paddocks that we've screened a number of years, and we're going to get full paddock history from the agronomist so that we can try and get a better understanding of those fungicide strategies that are leading to the resistance. So we are in a bit of a unique situation where we think we are capturing that sort of moment when SDHI resistance is probably going to become more of an issue. So this becomes a really good opportunity for us to learn a lot about the selection pressure and what is actually happening out there in the field. So watch this space. We'll be doing a lot of work this year and be making sure we're getting that information out there towards the end of this year. And lastly, just to thank all those who have submitted stubble for us for our screening each year, and of course our funders. So over to you, Nola.
Excellent. Thanks, Angela. Just a reminder, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to type them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and Angela can respond to those at the end of the presentations. So next we have Senior Research Scientist Harry Dadu from Ag Victoria, who's also based in Horsham. Harry works in the Field Crops Pathology team, conducting disease surveillance and screening germplasm for new fungal resistances in cereals. Today, he'll be updating you on the current resistance status of netform net blotch in Victoria. Over to you, Harry.
Thanks, Nola. Hello, all. I'm going to talk about net blotch, particularly netform net blotch fungicide resistance status, and more specifically, the results will be coming out of Victorian trials that we do in Victoria. And the results can be applicable slightly to South Australian situation as well, because we found mutations more in South Australia before we found in Victoria. And also suggestion to from the people from the other states to contact state respective state pathologists to understand what is the status for netform in their states. Oops. All right. So in terms of 2024, we found It was a very dry season, as everyone is aware, for both in Victoria and South Australia. But in Victoria, what we found was the disease was so highly prevalent, especially both the net blotches. As you can see in the crops that we surveyed, there were nearly 47% of crops which had some level of net blotch. And then there was spot form as well, which was second prevalent in barley diseases. In terms of other diseases, we still had tiny bits of scald here and there, and then leaf rust was very minimal. But in terms of net blotch, what we have seen in the last 3-4 seasons, we have seen a slight increase in prevalence, and also there was higher amount of severity, which was concerning and also causing yield losses in most of the susceptible paddocks which were grown with susceptible varieties. And in 2024, it was a bit of a surprise to see the level of severity as well in some of the paddocks, especially those paddocks which are grown with highly susceptible varieties. We have seen the severity was as close to 90%, and which means you could imagine they would have definitely got some yield losses there. And as I just spoke about susceptible varieties, the biggest reason to find net form even in a season which was very non-conducive is because the level of susceptible area that is under susceptible varieties in Victoria, and also the stubble retention policies or the farming systems that currently we grow the crops under. So this shows that the pathogen can survive even the conditions which are not really conducive, because they have a host which they can easily infect and cause disease. And also stubble retention means there is chance for the pathogen to survive on the stubble in the off season, and also produce new pathotypes which can be impactful they can be more virulent on new varieties, or they can be more virulent with more fungicide resistance capabilities as well. So we have situations where we can assure that we can have net form every season, but it depends on the severity will definitely depend on how the conditions will turn out to be. But to start with, we have seen a bad season, but still we have seen really good disease as well, where we have lost some yield for net form. So the message here is always try to avoid susceptible varieties when growing or when trying to manage for disease, and more particularly for net form. We found over the past decade, applying fungicides was been really good to a good efficacy, or they are effective for controlling net form. This data is coming from 2020 in one of the trials where we had using RGT Planet and looking different fungicides for controlling net form. And as you can see from the graph, the untreated control has 7% yield loss with a good amount of 20% disease severity, whereas all the other foliar fungicide applications, starting with Sestiva as a seed treatment and Prosaro as a foliar fungicide treatment, we found good control of the disease, and also the yield losses were very minimal. In fact, Sestiva and Prosaro did show that 0% of yield loss in few of those applications. That was in 2020, and then soon after 2020, we have seen lab detections of fungicide resistance in some of the SDHIs that we use, and also in some of the DMIs. And what that has been in terms of field use of these chemicals. So this graph shows what is the current status in Victoria particularly, and also show the trend of the mutations or the frequency of mutations that we have seen every season. And if you're talking about SDHIs, the SDHI so mainly released in Victoria in 2015 for controlling net blotches. And in 2019 was the year where we have seen, or CCDM has seen, first detection of the mutation, which actually meant that it is showing resistance. That was in South Australia. In 2021, we have found a similar mutation in Victoria as well, but the frequencies were very low. And coming to 2023, we have seen a higher amount of mutations. The frequencies were somewhere around 20 to 30%, but we still haven't seen high level of field failure, but we have seen some extent of reduced efficacies. And in 24, we have seen the frequencies ranging up to 99% in some of the paddocks where I just spoke about 90% disease severity. So those paddocks, what we have seen, we have collected samples and we have sent to CCDM for fungicide testing, and the results say they had mutations of around with frequencies of about 99%, which essentially says that the field failure that you're seeing or the disease that you're seeing is because of a failure of the chemical in the field. And this is, I'll put more evidence in the following slides, which shows that it is quite widespread in Victoria. And this happened for the SDHIs. It took only 10 years to see the levels that we are seeing from the release. So which means that the outlook is very scary in terms of what happens if a premier chemical is not doing so well. With regards to DMIs, we have seen a similar trend as well. I'm not really sure when the DMIs were introduced in Victoria for controlling net blotches, but what we have seen is there was a detection in 2021 in Victoria where we have seen more resistant pathotypes or resistant mutations. And in 2023, we have seen that mutation frequency has got out of control in terms of there was few results where we can relate that there are field failures. And in 24, the frequencies were ranging around 79 to 99% in the samples that we have tested in 24 from the paddocks where we believe that they are suspected with fungicide resistance. That shows both the DMIs and both the SDHIs have shown to some level of resistance. Netform has shown some level of resistance to both these premier compounds, which means some of the chemicals that we are using under these groups might be under severe threat in terms of they might be compromised, or we probably can't use anymore in some of the crops. Also, in another revelation, BASF has worked in South Australia, and they have found a new mutation which actually affects the sensitivity of quinols or strobilurin group of chemicals, which are not routinely used as well as DMIs and SDHIs on blotches, but we still use some of the compounds. This is a relatively new discovery, which means like it might take a few more years to see what is exactly, whether it is actually effective in field or not. But the current situation is still unknown, so there's needed to be more work to be done on this front. But this is also another evidence to say that netform is becoming very virulent or becoming very problematic in terms of fungicides. So what all these findings mean for in-field netform management? We have seen in the last 2 years in field trials some of the results which help us to understand what it can mean. I'll probably put those slides now and explain. This was the trial, which is a very similar trial that you have seen in one of the earlier slides in 2020. And we have done a similar experiment in Horsham again. What we have seen is the Sestiva or Proceros have shown reduced performance when compared to untreated control in terms of controlling disease and also in terms of yield gain. As you can see from the graphs, the untreated control had nearly 15 to 20% of yield loss, whereas Sestiva also had non-significant results, which say that they couldn't really control the disease to the extent that it did in 2020. And the samples from all these plots were sent to CCDM once again. And once we saw the results, we have seen increase of mutations from 0 to 50% after the application of the chemicals, especially for Sestiva and also for Procero, where we have seen nearly 40% of mutations which for DMIs. So these results actually explain why we are seeing a little bit of field failure coming out of those plots which were treated with fungicides, but still there was efficacy in some of the chemicals, or it might be dependent on timing as well. That was the first instance where I have personally noticed some issues with fungicides for netform. And in 2024, we have done really good surveillance across Victoria. And in some of the paddocks, as I just said at the start of the presentation, we have seen field level failures in especially the crops which were grown with highly susceptible varieties. And this was the one of the evidence from a couple of NVT trials where we have scored for netform, net blotch. And the varieties, the data here shows disease severity scores from 1 to 9 scale. 1 is highly resistant, whereas 9 is highly susceptible disease score or yeah, you can equal 9 to 90% of disease severity as well. What we have seen was very surprising at the time. And then I called BCG and SFS, who were managing those trials at Hamilton and Canaiva, and found what were the chemicals that they were using on these particular varieties, because this is a treated trial. And so these are the fungicides they gave me that they have used at that point of time. For Hamilton, they had in-furrow fungicide, which is flutrifol, seed fungicide, which is fluxapyroxate, and 2 foliar fungicide applications at flag -2 and Z49 growth stage, which were prothioconazole and a mix of prothioconazole and tibuconazole and azoxystrobin and epoxyconazole. Whereas in Canaiva, it was 3 foliar fungicides, prothio plus tibuconazole at 1 time or 2 times, and then propiconazole in between. And for me, all these fungicides should be more effective in field. But what we have seen is clearly in some of those varieties, as you can see on the right side, they have clearly, the fungicides couldn't control the disease on these varieties. Whereas on the other side of the table, which were in green, they were all, some of them are highly resistant varieties, and which means despite adding fungicides, they did control the disease themselves with their resistance. And one important feature of that green list is look at what Spartacus was doing. Spartacus is a variety which is equally susceptible for net form as RGD Planet. And what we have seen is completely clean plot in that trials, both the trials. And this, again, led me to think like what is happening here. And once we put the results across that we have collected across some RGD Planet and susceptible variety related paddocks across Victoria, we came to a conclusion that it is a pathotype that is more virulent on plant and and similar backgrounds, is causing or is having more resistance or developed into a pathotype which has more resistance to the fungicides. Whereas those ones which are not affecting Spartacus, they didn't have any, that pathotype didn't have any virulence or towards planet or towards the fungicides. So that shows that if you're growing planet or any related background varieties, you might see that fungicides might be showing reduced performance just because that pathotype is more virulent on these varieties, and also it has a capability to resist fungicide usage. And I did, these are the results coming out of those 2 particular NVT trials. What we have done is we sent, as soon as suspecting them to be fungicide resistant, I have sent them for CCDM for testing, and these are the results. At Hamilton, we have seen for DMIs, there was 98.53% of mutations. For SDHIs, we did find 0.06 for the mutation that we generally see in Victoria, but there was a new mutation which was around 34.15%. But that mutation is, we are not sure whether that is actually causing the resistance for fluxapyroxate, but we might need to do more investigation on that. Whereas similar results were also found at Canaiva. We found nearly 98% of mutations for resistant mutations for DMIs, and also 99% of mutations for SDHIs as well. So these evidences show that, there is fungicide resistance in Victoria, which is hampering the effectiveness of fungicides on net form, net blotch, and unfortunately, both of them are the compounds that we regularly use for net form are sort of compromised. This doesn't mean that every chemical in that groups are compromised, but there are some chemicals which are compromised. So where do we go? This is the graph which shows the extent of the insensitive populations across Victoria. All those red dots on the map show that those are the regions where we have found resistant mutations over the last 3 seasons. Shows that the data shows that net form, net blotch fungicide resistance is quite widespread, and it might be challenging for controlling disease if you're using those specific fungicides which I just mentioned. So what is the solution for controlling the net form, net blotch in future years? The best thing is always follow IDM strategies. To start with, give less emphasis on using fungicides, which means you'll start having a better rated varieties, use highly rated resistant varieties for net form, and also engage with paddock selection, as another tool, which means do not sow barley on barley, which means you're actually reducing some inoculum load and also the less chance of having more disease to start with. And also this gives a less opportunity to use fungicides depending on the season. And also try adjusting sowing time. There is evidence to say that if you're avoiding early sowing, especially with some of these stubble-borne diseases, you might be okay to leave the early infection and also reduce the use of fungicides once again. But more importantly, if you're using fungicides, do not spray on the resistant varieties, because you don't need to spray if the season is not so conducive. You don't need to use fungicides on resistant varieties. And also with barley, as you know, there will be a lot of physiological spots which actually look like net form or net blotches. Yeah, make sure you get correct diagnosis. If you're not diagnosing the disease really well, that means you are prompted to go with fungicides, which is not a good idea. So that means not every blotch is a fungal disease in barley. Also, we have got really 10 years worth of data which showed that barley net blotch, especially net blotches, can cause yield loss only if the yield potential is greater than 4 tons per hectare. So always remember your situation or your paddock potential from the past seasons and understand whether you need to use a fungicide. If the potential is very less, then don't apply. And late epidemics is not going to be a cause of concern. Late epidemics always have less disease. And also this means you don't need to apply fungicides proactively. And dry seasons like 2024, especially, you don't need to apply too many fungicides in such seasons. Yeah, please monitor the season conditions and also understand when to apply fungicides. And also wherever you have known fungicide resistance, please follow all the principles which Ange said in respect to using fungicides. Don't use 2 SDHIs in a season. Mix and rotate all the DMIs if you're using, and also don't use 2 back-to-back quinols or strobilurin fungicides as well to reduce or to slow the fungicide resistance development. With that, I'll hand over back to Nola. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Harry. If anyone has any questions, please type them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and I'll ask Harry those questions at the end of our presentation. So our final speaker today is Senior Research Scientist Andrea Hills from the Department of Primary Industries and Rural Development in WA. She's been involved in agricultural field research for over 20 years and the past 12 as a field pathologist across cereals, canola and pulses from the high to the low rainfall zones. She's based in a beautiful part of Australia, down in Esperance on the south coast of WA. And today we'll be talking to you about what's new in wheat powdery mildew in WA. Thanks, Andrea.
Great. Thank you. So as just said, we're getting an update on wheat powdery mildew in WA. Next slide, please. So we've developed the Great Way DMI mutation in WA. But the good news is in the eastern states, the situation is unchanged from last season. If you're from the east and you want more information, go to the AFREN website, or there's also a really good GRDC fact sheet that you can download to learn more. Next slide, please. So the gateway mutation to DMI is a lab detection. It doesn't have any impact at the field level, but it does give us a big warning that now more than ever we need to apply those fungicide resistance 5 strategies to try and slow down any potential progress that in further mutations. Next slide, please. So what has changed to cause this? Well, unfortunately, nothing has changed, and that's why we're in this situation. In WA, we still grow a huge amount of susceptible varieties. Can you click again, please? And this graph shows the variety breakdown for WA last year by area of the wheat crop. And you'll see the red part, that's the very susceptible varieties, and the orange, the susceptible varieties. Basically, the 3/4 of the WA wheat sowings are to susceptible or worse varieties. So things like septa are sitting out there in the medium to high rainfall, and they're pumping out a huge amount of disease spores. And with, fungicide resistance is a numbers game. So we're giving mildew the opportunity to mutate, and unfortunately it's happened. It's changed in response to using DMIs, and that's because basically we're using DMIs with every fungicide application. So what we want to do at this point is try and get away from septa. I realise we can't do that this year, we're pretty much locked in, but over the next couple of years try to reduce or replace septa, because even if we are sowing a variety that's considered moderately susceptible, that's still a big lift in being able to push down that disease pressure and give the DMIs a bit of a break. They don't have to work as hard to control or try to control a runaway disease. Next slide, please. And the next one. So the testing we've done today, or testing that CCDM has done today over the last 10 years, is what we can see on this map. And you'll see the green belt, the little grey dots are tests where the wheat mildew is unchanged, it's still the same. And then there are some red stars, and that's where the gateway mutation has been found. CCDM tests all the samples for DMI as well as strobe resistance, but so far the gateway mutation is just in the DMI. Next slide, please. If we zero in on the tests or the samples that were done and samples that were submitted and tested last season, most of them came from the southern area, and you really get a good idea of where those mutations were, primarily or exclusively in the Esperance region and all across the region from the high to the low rainfall. I guess the good news is that we didn't get any strobe resistance, but the bad news is if you are in the rest of WA thinking you're off the hook, well, you're not, because basically mildew will spread quite easily. So as we saw with barley powdery mildew resistance, it can spread quite readily to other areas of the state over time. Next slide, please. If we have a look at the gateway mutation itself, this is simply giving us a good indication that the wheat mildew gene is changing in response to the DMIs that have been applied. It sets the stage for more mutations that can have the field level effects that both Ange and Harry have been talking about in other crops. That's what we want to avoid, or at least try and slow down as much as possible. I've got a bit of analogy up the top right corner. You can see the old temperature gauge. And if we think of the pin here showing that we're getting pretty close to the red line at the top, red line being the fungicide reduced sensitivity or full-blown resistance to fungicides, that's what we want to avoid. That's what the gateway mutation is telling us, that we're getting very close to that point. Next slide, please. So if we can change our varieties and get a bit more resistance into the ones we're growing, what we'll do is reduce that amount of inoculum, we'll reduce the opportunity for more mutations to occur, we'll maintain the efficacy, hopefully, of our DMI fungicides. Because, to push this analogy a little bit further, if we go down the bottom here, not only are we close to the red line for fungicide resistance, you'll also notice the fuel tank is getting quite low here. And the fuel tank analogy here is that in WA broadacre ag, we have very few fungicide groups for controlling diseases. And we really, hence they're quite precious, and so we really need to look after them. Next. So to slow that mutation process up, slow less septa, that'll slow the whole disease cycle down, decrease that disease pressure. rotate all our fungicide groups, and keep in mind that in-furrow applications of fungicide count. And if you do have poor control, go back and check your records. That'll give you a better idea of whether actually the fungicide was applied maybe a bit too late, maybe disease had already become a little bit more established in the crop, and it can be difficult to control in a susceptible variety once it's established, or perhaps potentially a water quality issue. Something else. Let's find out whether application had something to do with why you may have seen a reduction in performance. If not, then let's get it tested. We're not the fungicide police. If you have done 2 DMIs in a row, we're not going to come out and arrest you, but let's get it tested. Let's find out what's going on so everyone in the industry can keep abreast of what's happening. Get in contact with us. So in terms of trying to preserve our DMI fungicides, we really want to have a look at a couple of the ways we're using them. And avoiding the applications of just DMIs alone is ideally the way to go. I know that there is a reasonable amount of use of epoxyconazole as a single application, but if we could put a mixed partner with that, that would be the best strategy going forward, even if it is a second DMI. Next slide, please. Rotate the DMI actives so that you are, even if you've got a strobium and a DMI and then a SDHI and a DMI, but it's not actually the same one all the way through the season. Next slide. Keeping them to a minimum of 3 in a season, and that's all about trying to be a bit more strategic about when you're applying them, not applying them if the season isn't conducive, if it's you've got no subsoil moisture, all those types of integrated disease management aspects to consider. And finally, always use our SDHIs and strobies in a mixture. Next one. So the fungicide resistance 5. One more, please. In a nutshell, this basically encapsulates exactly what the other speakers have also said. The variety selection is the whole basis of integrated disease management. It just makes your life so much easier. Mildew at the best of times in the high rainfall south coast is problematic to control. If we start to get fungicide resistance on top of that, it's going to be quite a problem for management ongoing, and in terms of economically as well. For non-chemical management, well, most people do have a rotation and are limiting wheat on wheat in higher and medium rainfall areas, but also consider something like your time of sowing. DPIRD agronomy trials have consistently shown that there's very little advantage to sowing before the first week of May. But when we go out to do a disease trial, I know sometimes we deliberately sow early because that increases the disease pressure on the varieties. So moderate your time of sowing. And then finally, that fungicide should ultimately be the last resort, not the first, to managing our diseases. So finally, next slide, I'd like to spruik a few fungicide resistance workshops that AFREN are having this year in WA. So there will be two-day workshops, one at Geraldton and another in Perth, where Fran Lopez, Jeff Thomas, Nick Paul, the team will be there talking about the different crops, the different situations. Come along, it's a great learning opportunity. And at the Esperance Downs Research Station, we'll have a bit of a field walk later this year, have a trial that I'm doing there, and a session on fungicide resistance again. And finally, thanks for your time this morning. Please get in touch if you are having problems managing mildew. We can talk you through it, or if you'd like to have some sampling done. so that we can send them up to CCDM for you. Quite happy to do that, liaise with growers or agronomists. Thanks very much. Back to you.
Thanks, Andrea. That's great information. Actually, just stay on there. I have a question for you from somebody. It says, why esperance for the emergence of resistance? Is this the EP of WA? Does that mean epicenter?
Well, esperance, okay, so a colleague of mine, Jason Bradley, based in Perth, did some really nice epidemiological work a few years ago on wheat mildew, and when he looked at sort of climatic conditions and did that desktop analysis, basically esperance comes out as just ideal conditions for something like 5 months of the growing season because of the humidity. They don't sell evaporative air conditioners down here. We get quite a bit of humidity. It's not like Darwin, but it's enough that mildew ticks along, and we do love our scepter down here, so that's also feeds into it.
Excellent, thank you for that. I have another open question to probably all of the panel, or Fran may be able to answer. Integrated disease management is often highlighted as a key strategy for controlling crop diseases and managing resistance. While genetic resistance in crops is a well-established component, what are your thoughts on the role of crop nutrition in helping plants defend themselves against disease? Is this approach being used in the field? And is there local data or research initiatives being done to support or look into more details the effectiveness of this approach?
Does anybody want to answer that question, or should I just try to give it a go?
Well, I will say for canola, we know that if the plants are stressed, then you do get a bigger impact from the amount of disease you have. So the plant can tolerate up to around 50% colonization by the fungus before you'll see a yield penalty. But if it's a extremely dry year, so you've got drought conditions, then all of a sudden you might only need 30% infection for you to start to see yield loss. But if it's a wet year and there's plenty of moisture, then the plant can tolerate more disease. So definitely nutrients and stress is going to have an impact on how much the disease has an impact then on yield and things like that. So it definitely will make a difference.
I'd say from the nutrition point of view, we know that in that nitrogen, mildew is a nitrogen lover. It's a parasitic pathogen. The higher the nitrogen rates, generally the more disease there is. In WA on the sandy soils, we also have an interaction sometimes with potassium. So if potassium levels are marginal, that can also increase disease. So there's a couple of factors to keep in the back of your mind.
Okay, I'll move on to the next question. Can somebody discuss the merit of fungicide tank mixtures using alternate mode of action groups?
I think that's a Fran question.
Happy to take it. Unless there's somebody from the panel that wants to address it, but I'm happy to take it. Look at combining fungicides from different groups into a mixture is always a good strategy for dealing with fungicide resistance. But that's only a very good strategy when you don't have fungicide resistance, right? If you don't have fungicide resistance and you've got multiple fungicides in a tank mix from different groups, so your pathogens are going to be exposed to basically different fungicides, and those fungicides are going to be targeting different things in their cells. So it's going to be harder for them to develop resistance against those fungicides simultaneously. Now, what you have to take into account is that sometimes the chemistries are not compatible. So, and that's something that you have to check with your with the manufacturers of those fungicides. That's critically important. Okay. The other thing to take into account is that when you're mixing fungicides, you have to take consideration around the labels of those fungicides that you're mixing, so that you don't exceed the label rates for each of the fungicides in that mix. Okay.
Thanks, Fran. Maybe you can add on to that as well. Would the use of adjuvants help minimise fungicide resistance?
And the adjuvant by itself will not be contributing to mitigating fungicide resistance, but the adjuvant is a piece of engineering that has been included into that formulation to enhance the activity or the persistence or the penetration capacity of that fungicide. So that adjuvant, the chemistry behind that adjuvant is going to be contributing to the effectiveness of the fungicide at the end of the day. So in a way, it's an indirect contribution towards that efficacy, the fungicide efficacy. It will not be having an effect on mitigating fungicide resistance, but it can have an effect on, for example, the control of the disease, right? Higher level of control. So yeah, there are not a lot of studies on that, I'm afraid. But yeah, so adjuvants are not direct contributors to mitigating fungicide resistance.
I unmute myself. Thank you for that. I believe that is the end of our questions at the moment, unless anybody would like to put a final one in the Q&A there. However, we have probably come to the end of our time. Bridget, can you put up the slide prior to that one? Thank you. So thank you all. Unfortunately, we do have to wrap it up there. I wanted to reiterate our take-home message, which is the fungicide resistance 5. So we have to avoid susceptible crop varieties, rotate the crops, use non-chemical disease management, strategically spray only when necessary, and rotate and mix your mode of action groups. And so to help you with all of this, we have the next slide, please, Bridget. A whole website of resources that I do encourage you to go and have a look at. Alternatively, you're quite welcome to send me an email directly. So on behalf of all of you, thank you to Angela, Harry, Andrea and Fran for all your presentations and your discussions. And from all of us at AFREN, thank you for attending our webinar today. We'd really appreciate your feedback when you leave the webinar. And we hope that you've gained some really good information today that's helped you to understand more about fungicide resistance in your area. Thank you very much.